Let me tell you about Jacob Fletcher, a man who thought he'd seen everything the Arizona Territory could throw at him. November 1881. And Jake was tracking an 8-point buck through the Chiricahua foothills when he stumbled onto something that would change his life forever. The buck's trail had gone cold near Skeleton Canyon, but Jake kept pushing through the scrub brush, figuring he'd pick up the tracks on the other side of the wash. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these mountains. Not the cry of a mountain lion or the scream of a hawk, but something human, something desperate. Jake's hand went to his Springfield rifle, and he crept forward, using the rocks for cover. What he found in that canyon made his blood run cold and hot all at once. She was there, naked as the day she was born. Tied to a mesquite tree with her hands bound above her head, an Apache woman, maybe 25 years old, with rope burns cutting deep into her wrists. Her body was covered in fresh bruises, and blood trickled from a cut above her eye. She'd been beaten badly, left to die in the desert heat. Jake could see the wagon tracks leading away from the tree, heading north toward the mining camps. He stood frozen for maybe 10 seconds, his mind racing through possibilities. This was Apache country, and the wars between settlers and tribes had turned brutal. But looking at her hanging there, defenseless and suffering, Jake couldn't see an enemy. He saw a human being who needed help, and something deep in his chest told him walking away would haunt him forever. Before we move on, take a break with me, Joe. Pour yourself a warm cup of tea. Settle in and tell me what time it is, where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying this story so far, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Jake approached slowly, keeping his rifle slung over his shoulder to show he meant no harm. Her eyes followed him, dark and fierce despite the pain she must have been feeling. She didn't cry out or beg, just watched him with a gaze that seemed to measure every step he took, calculating whether he was there to finish what someone else had started. "Easy now," Jake said quietly, though he doubted she understood English. "I'm going to cut you down." He pulled his Bowie knife from his belt, and she tensed, her muscles coiling like she was preparing to fight even in her weakened state. Jake respected that. Out here, that kind of spirit kept you alive. He cut the ropes binding her wrists, and she collapsed forward. Jake caught her before she hit the ground, and for a moment their faces were inches apart. He could see the determination burning in her eyes, the refusal to surrender even when her body was failing. She smelled of sweat and blood and sage, and Jake felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt since his wife died 3 years back in a Comanche raid. She tried to push away from him, tried to stand on her own, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Jake shrugged off his wool shirt and draped it around her shoulders. It hung to her knees, covering her modesty. She pulled it tight around herself, still watching him like he might turn on her any second. "Can you walk?" he asked. She stared at him, uncomprehending, so he pointed to his feet and made a walking motion. She tried, took 2 steps, and her knees buckled. Jake caught her again, and this time, when he lifted her into his arms, she didn't fight. She was lighter than he expected, all lean muscle and bone, a body built for survival in this harsh land. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he felt her breathing slow as exhaustion took her under. Jake's cabin sat 3 miles from where he'd found her, tucked into a pine grove with a creek running nearby. It wasn't much, just 1 room with a fireplace, a bed, a table, and his few possessions scattered around, but it was home, and it was safe. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her gently on his bed. The November sun was already setting, painting the cabin walls orange and gold. Jake lit the oil lamp and got to work. He heated water over the fire, tore up his spare shirt for bandages, and brought out the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. Her eyes opened as he approached with a wet cloth, and she flinched back. "This is gonna hurt," he said, showing her the cloth. "But it'll clean the wounds. Infection'll kill you faster than anything out here." He didn't know if she understood his words, but something in his tone must have gotten through because she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Jake cleaned the cuts on her face first, gentle as he could manage with his rough hands. She never made a sound, just gritted her teeth and stared at the ceiling. When he moved to check her ribs, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Their eyes met, and Jake saw the question there plain as day. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said firmly. "You got my word on that." He pointed to himself. "Jake." "My name's Jake." Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She studied him for a long moment, then released his wrist. Her lips moved, forming a word that sounded like wind through canyon walls. "Ayanna," Jake smiled. "Ayanna. That's pretty." Night fell fast in the mountains, bringing with it a cold that cut through clothes and settled into bones. Jake built up the fire until it roared, filling the small cabin with warmth and flickering light. Ayanna watched him from the bed, clutching his shirt around herself. She hadn't spoken again, but her eyes tracked his every movement. Jake made a simple stew from dried venison, potatoes, and wild onions. The smell filled the cabin, and he saw Ayanna's nostrils flare. When was the last time she'd eaten? He dished out 2 bowls and brought one to her, along with a spoon. She took the bowl, but ignored the spoon, drinking straight from the rim. Jake did the same, not wanting to make her feel strange. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. When she finished, Ayanna set the bowl aside and pulled Jake's shirt tighter. She was shivering despite the fire. Jake grabbed his bedroll from the corner and started to spread it on the floor near the hearth. "Whoppy?" Ayanna's voice startled him. She was pointing at the bedroll, then at the floor, then at him. Her meaning was clear enough. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I'll sleep down here. Bed's yours." He pointed at her, then at the bed, making sleeping motions. She shook her head firmly and pointed at the bed, then at both of them. Jake felt heat rise in his face. "That ain't proper, miss." But Ayanna was already scooting to one side of the narrow bed, making room. She patted the space beside her, then mimed shivering. Jake understood. She was still cold, and out here, warmth was survival. There was nothing improper about 2 people sharing body heat to stay alive. At least that's what he told himself as he climbed onto the bed, keeping a careful distance between them. Morning came with pale November light filtering through the cabin's one window. Jake woke to find Ayanna already awake, sitting up in bed and watching him with those intense dark eyes. She looked stronger today, the color returning to her face. When Jake sat up, she pointed to his scarred forearm and spoke in Apache, her voice lilting with questions. Jake pulled up his sleeve, showing the long scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "Arrow," he said, miming someone shooting. "Lipan Apache 4 years back. Near cost me the arm." Ayanna's eyebrows rose, and she said something in her language that sounded almost like approval. Then she pointed to her own shoulder, where a puckered scar the size of a silver dollar marked her brown skin. "Bullet," she said in heavily accented English, making Jake's eyes widen. She knew some English after all. Ayanna tapped her chest. "Soldier, Fort Bowie." Her face darkened with the memory. Ayanna's husband. Dead. 2 winters. Jake felt his throat tighten. So she'd lost someone, too. They had that in common, at least. Over breakfast of cornbread and coffee, they began to communicate. Ayanna knew maybe 20 English words, and Jake knew exactly 3 words in Apache. But they made it work. Through gestures, drawings in the dirt floor, and patient repetition, a story emerged. 3 white men had taken Ayanna from her camp 6 days ago. They'd wanted information about where her people were hiding. When she refused to talk, they beat her, stripped her, and left her tied to that tree as a warning to others. Jake's jaw clenched as she told it. "The men," he said slowly, "did you see them? Would you know them?" Ayanna nodded, her eyes going hard as stone. She held up 3 fingers, then drew in the dirt with a stick from the fire. 3 rough faces emerged, one with a distinctive beard, another with a scar across his nose, the third missing an ear. Jake stared at the drawings and felt cold settle into his gut. He knew these men. They were prospectors working a claim near Silver City, and they were mean as rattlesnakes. 3 days passed, and Ayanna grew stronger. She helped around the cabin, despite Jake's protests, insisting on earning her keep. She was good with her hands, mending his torn clothes with neat stitches, preparing meals with wild herbs she gathered near the creek. Jake found himself looking forward to each morning, to the quiet companionship they'd developed. On the 4th day, Ayanna asked him a question that changed everything. They were sitting by the fire after supper, and she turned to him with those penetrating eyes. "Why?" she asked simply, her English improving daily. "Why you help Ayanna? White man hate Apache." Jake stared into the flames, considering his answer. "My wife, Sarah," he began slowly. "Comanches killed her 3 years back while I was out hunting. When I got home, found her in the garden, and our baby girl, too. She was only 2 years old." His voice cracked. "I buried them both under the cottonwood tree behind the house. Then I burned the whole place down. Couldn't stand to look at it no more. Came out here to die, I guess. Or at least to be alone with my grief." Ayanna placed her hand on his arm, and Jake felt warmth spread from that touch. "But when I saw you tied to that tree," he continued, "I thought about Sarah, about how I wasn't there to help her when she needed me most. Maybe I couldn't save my wife, but I could damn sure save you." He looked at her directly. "Figured maybe that's why I'm still alive, to do some good before I go." Ayanna's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. Jake's breath caught, but he didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, 2 wounded souls finding comfort in each other's presence. When she finally looked up at him, her face was inches from his. Jake could feel the warmth of her breath, see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. That night, as they lay in the bed they now shared without awkwardness, Ayanna turned to face Jake in the darkness. He could see her outline in the dim firelight, could feel the heat radiating from her body. She said something in Apache, soft and questioning. Then, before Jake could respond, she kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative, like she was testing whether he'd push her away. But Jake didn't push. Instead, he pulled her closer, his hand tangling in her long black hair. The kiss deepened, became urgent. desperate. 3 years of loneliness and grief poured out of Jake, meeting Ayana's own need for connection, for affirmation that she was still alive, still human, despite what had been done to her. His shirt, the one she still wore, came off easily. In the firelight, her body was beautiful, all curves and strength, marked by the scars of a hard life. Jake traced those scars with his fingertips, and Ayana shivered beneath his touch. She helped him out of his own clothes, her hands exploring his chest, his shoulders, the rough terrain of his body. They made love slowly, carefully, aware of her healing injuries, but driven by a need that transcended physical desire. This was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from both of them, the capacity to feel, to want, to be vulnerable with another person. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Ayana's head on Jake's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. Neither of them spoke. Words would have cheapened what had just passed between them. Instead, they held each other as the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them both. Jake was chopping wood behind the cabin when he saw the riders, 3 of them coming up the trail from the south. His blood turned to ice when he recognized the leader, a heavy-set man with a thick beard. It was one of the faces Ayana had drawn in the dirt. The men who'd left her to die had come looking. He dropped the axe and ran for the cabin. "Ayana, we got trouble!" She was at the window instantly looking out, and Jake saw her face go pale. She said something sharp in Apache, and Jake didn't need a translation. She'd recognized them too. Jake grabbed his rifle and checked the loads while Ayana moved to the corner where he kept his old Navy Colt. She picked it up with practiced ease, checking the cylinder. "You know how to use that?" Jake asked. Ayana gave him a look that said she'd insulted him with the question. Jake nodded. "Right. Stay low and don't shoot unless they come through that door." The riders were calling out now, their voices carrying across the clearing. "Fletcher, we know you got that Apache squaw in there. Send her out, and we'll leave you be." Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "She's under my protection, boys. Best you ride on." The bearded man laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Your protection don't mean shit, Fletcher. That savage belongs to us. We caught her fair and square, and we aim to collect the bounty on her head." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "There ain't no bounty. You boys just want revenge because she wouldn't talk. Well, she's got nothing to say to you." The man with the scarred nose spat tobacco juice. "We're going to count to 10, Fletcher. Then we're coming in. And if you're in our way, you'll die alongside her. 1, 2, 3. Jake glanced back at the cabin door where Ayana stood, visible through the gap. She met his eyes and nodded once. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. The count reached 10, and all hell broke loose. The bearded man went for his gun first, and Jake's rifle barked, the shot catching him in the shoulder and spinning him off his horse. The other 2 scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and trees. Bullets thunked into the cabin walls, shattered the window glass. Jake dropped behind the porch railing and fired again, keeping them pinned. Ayana was at the window, the Colt bucking in her hands as she fired at the man with the missing ear. Her first shot went wide, but the second caught him in the leg, and he went down screaming. That left one, the man with the scarred nose, and he was circling around toward the back of the cabin. Jake saw him moving and shouted a warning, but he was already inside, crashing through the back door. Jake spun and fired from the hip, but the shot went high. The man tackled him, and they went down hard, grappling for the rifle between them. Jake could smell whiskey and tobacco on the man's breath as they struggled. A fist caught Jake in the jaw, rattling his teeth. He brought his knee up hard, connected with something soft, and the man grunted in pain. Then a gunshot, impossibly loud in the close confines of the cabin. The man on top of Jake went rigid, his eyes wide with shock. He toppled sideways, and Jake saw Ayanna standing there, the smoking Colt in her hands. She'd shot the man point blank in the back. Jake scrambled to his feet, breathing hard. Outside, the wounded, bearded man was trying to drag himself toward his horse. Jake stepped onto the porch. "Go," Jake said coldly. "Tell whoever's listening that this woman's protected. Anyone comes for her, they'll answer to me." The man looked at his dead companion, at his wounded friend, and nodded frantically. He managed to get into his saddle and spurred his horse south, not looking back. Jake lowered his rifle and turned to find Ayanna staring at the man she'd killed, her hands shaking. The sun was setting, painting the mountains red and gold, when Jake and Ayanna buried the dead man behind the cabin. It was hard work, and neither of them spoke as they filled in the grave. When it was done, they stood side by side, looking out at the wilderness stretching away to the horizon. "They come back," Ayanna said quietly. "More men, always more." Jake knew she was right. Word would spread that he was harboring an Apache woman. The army might come, or bounty hunters, or just mean men looking for trouble. This cabin, this refuge, would never be safe again. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes questioning. "You sorry? Sorry you help Ayanna?" Jake took her face in his hands. "Not for 1 second. But you got a choice to make now. You can go back to your people, find safety with your tribe. I can take you to them. Make sure you get there safe." Ayanna shook her head firmly. "Tribe gone, scattered. Ayanna go back, Ayanna alone." She placed her hand over his heart. "Here, not alone. Here, have Jake." Something broke open in Jake's chest, something that had been frozen since Sarah died. "Then we leave," he said. "Tonight. Head north to Colorado Territory, find a place where nobody knows us. Start fresh." Ayanna smiled, and it transformed her face. "Together?" she asked. "Together," Jake confirmed. They packed what they could carry, loaded 2 horses, and rode out under the stars. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, a monument to the moment 2 broken people had found each other. Jake didn't know what the future held, didn't know if they'd make it to Colorado or if more trouble would find them on the trail. But for the first time in 3 years, he had something to live for beyond mere survival. He had hope. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates tales of the wild frontier. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And remember, sometimes the hunt for one thing leads you to find something else entirely, something you didn't even know you needed.